Alright, I've always found the idea of seasonal content to be interesting. On one hand, you get FOMO as things are limited time, but on the other hand, it can offer different avenues of gameplay that wouldn't necessarily be good for the average state of the game, but would still be fun for short periods of time. I think it'd actually be pretty interesting if a game like Honkai Star Rail had the latter. Quick disclaimer, this is all just opinions. Whether you agree or not, I'm just a random guy yapping on the internet with ideas about how one of his favorite games could be a little bit better. Don't take it too seriously. Moving on, let me explain my thought process here. In my opinion, there's good seasonal content, and then there's bad seasonal content. I would consider bad seasonal content something similar to Genshin's summer events. While usually very fun, these events offer completely new regions that are limited time. And if you weren't playing the game, or God forbid, you were busy during that event's duration, then the only way that you get to experience them is through a YouTube video. On the other hand, I would consider good seasonal content to be something that changes the way the game works, if only for a limited time. A great example of this would be Arknight's Contingency Contract game mode. In that game mode, they offer new, permanent stages of combat, along with different choosable modifiers to make the game more or less difficult depending on how you as the player want to play, with the overall goal being to clear those stages at higher levels of difficulty. I think there's a lot of interesting ways that gameplay like this could be implemented, especially into a turn-based game like HSR. The most baseline thing would be having a period of time where the balance shifts by doing something like having enemies with damage resistance against something like ice be more prominent. Taking it a step further, they could then introduce new mechanics to different elements, like letting the entire wind element apply wind shear on attacks, which incentivizes using them for extra dot damage. Taking it even further, they could then add modifiers to the enemies, like making certain enemies spawn asleep, but they wake up after you attack them with increased stats, causing you to pick and choose which unit to use because the fight may change based on how many enemies you hit, and it also causes you to be more careful about who you choose to target and when you choose to do so. These are just a few examples off the top of my head, but having something like that in for a season and then changing it up every once in a while could be a fun way to have new things for the game, where it might feel a little bit stagnant otherwise. I think at its core, what I'm really looking for here is a way for the game to always feel fresh. If we can't really get balance in the game in terms of direct buffs to characters, then I think the next best option is something seasonal, where sure, a character like Jade might be weaker as a seasonal modifier doesn't favor follow-up attacks, but the season after she might be the top of the meta, because there's a modifier that makes follow-ups more frequent. I do want to be clear, I'm not just asking for this kind of gameplay change to mix up the meta or whatever. Personally, I feel that balancing is the lesser part of what makes good seasonal content. The more important aspect is that it comes with content alongside of it. In Arknight's case, as I mentioned earlier, this comes with new stages. In HSR's case, with it being semi-open world, they could even introduce exploration aspects to it. Imagine if not only the balance temporarily changed, but you also get to actively experience those changes because you get to explore previously released regions that might be slightly different. Instead of just walking around the streets of Belobog, now you're walking around the streets of Belobog where there was a gas leak causing certain enemies to start the battles enraged, and defeating those enraged enemies is where you can get a part of your seasonal rewards. Things like this are realistically small aspects of the game that with small tweaks can feel completely fresh again, and also give you a reason to go back to places that you haven't been to in months. Genshin actually had something really similar to this back in its 2.5 patch, where we returned to Enkanomiya for the 3 Realms Gateway offering event. During that patch, we weren't exploring a new region as it had released the previous patch, we were just coming back to it and then exploring it in a new way. Darkness had covered Enkanomiya, and without leveling up an event-exclusive item, you couldn't progress to different regions of its map. There were toxins throughout the area that would kill your character if you stayed there too long, as well as harder enemies to fight. Leveling up that exclusive event item through opening chests or finding items or fighting those monsters would give your team buffs that you could use while exploring. For me personally, that event was super fun, and in my opinion wouldn't really be that hard to implement on the developer side for HSR. If they added some smoke clouds around Belobog, put a few chests around in different locations from the original spot, made small changes to how the enemies interact with you, and then added buffs or modifiers to make your characters, as well as the enemy characters, different, then the result is that you end up with a full suite of content for players to interact with. The next season could take us to the Luofu, and the one after could take us back to Belobog but in the underground this time, and the one after that could be on the Penacony ship. It would always be fresh, wouldn't really be that hard to do as it's using old game assets, and could even be used to sell certain characters. It's simple, but I think it would be a fun way to create things for players to interact with. I do want to clarify again, this is just me spitballing ideas here. I'm not really expecting something like this to actually happen, despite it being a slim possibility based on that one Genshin patch. That said, I feel that one of the things HSR lacks in patches that are mostly focused on story is content to play. As a result, I think something like seasonal content that works as a refresher for previous regions would be a neat way for the game to keep players busy without it feeling like too much of a time investment. Think about it yourself. If I asked you when was the last time you went to the Pillars of Creation on Belobog or the Seclusion Zone on the Herta space station, would you be able to tell me? Do you even remember what those locations were meant for? There's a lot of really cool areas throughout the game, but honestly, I personally couldn't even tell you the last time that I went to some of them. Again, the idea behind all of this is that I think the game should have more things to do that make it feel fresh. Logging in with nothing to really do other than spend your Trailblaze power to get your 50th double crit speed boot that rolls 5 times into flat defense is a really quick way for someone to get burned out and not feel as interested in the game as they could be. As I always say, these games are all about the characters, and I feel that having consistent content that we could use them in would be great. You might say that the simulated universe and its different modes can definitely fill the slot for this kind of idea, but what I think that mode lacks is diversity, which is kind of ironic considering it's currently called the Divergent Universe. Honestly, after you've played a few runs of each type to understand the mechanics like the dice and Swarm Disaster, then I feel that the runs don't really ever feel that different from each other unless you're pushing really deep into conundrum levels in those modes. Without significant changes to the blessings available, and no, adding one extra path per sim universe doesn't really count, I don't know if it's ever really going to break that mold of sameness that it has. To continue the bit I mentioned earlier, something like this could also be used to sell different characters, like the Jade example I gave. If the seasonal content modifiers favor one type of unit, then that encourages players to pull for different units that they may not have to interact with it. This would also open up endgame modes to be less focused on the banner characters because the basic seasonal content could be built for them instead. Realistically, I know that last part is wishful thinking, but I'd say it's a win-win all around. Players get the content, Hoyo gets the extra money, everyone is happy. Anyway, that's my rant. Thank you very much for watching, and if you haven't already, subscribe and maybe give my other videos a shot too.